Hello, listeners. It seems I have gotten myself into a rather predictable situation, having overpromised a bunch of videos at a time where I'm too busy to produce any. But despite the fact that I'm in fact putting off a lot of the larger projects that I promised, I'm still finding that there's a lot of things that I really want to comment on. They've been going on in the news recently, and most prominently among them has been this recent rash of sexual allegations against some of Hollywood's largest big shot producers and big shot actors. Most prominently, of course, was Harvey Weinstein, but then leading very quickly to Kevin Spacey, and now it looks like Louis C.K. And this is something that, I've seen in the news. Everyone's really been reacting to it over the last few weeks, and it's really been fascinating, really depressing, and it's been quite a revelation about the nature of our culture and the nature of Hollywood in the contemporary world. But one thing is that, as depressing as this all is, as, sort of fascinating it is in a morbid sort of way, as hard as it is to look away, and I think a lot of other people didn't really have any idea about how to react to it. I couldn't really summon any key insight about the situation. I knew Hollywood was corrupt. I wasn't quite aware as to the extent it was corrupt, and these revelations just seemed to be more shocking by the day. But for the longest time, I really couldn't put my finger on some way to make sense of the whole matter. Some new insight that I could bring to what everyone's been saying on the mainstream media, on the left and on the right. But recently, as I've sort of been milling this over in my mind, trying to take stock of this situation with not just one, but many Hollywood celebrities, I think I may have come to some insights that might be useful to anyone who's trying to make sense of this whole thing, to try to see how it fits into our current concept of modern culture and how it really plays into the culture war. Now, one of the strangest things about this whole endeavor, this whole situation with cultural elites being accused of horrible sexual misconduct, is how it sort of skirted the line between being both political and non-political. How it sort of intersected with a culture war, but then really didn't intersect with the culture war. And what I mean by this is, as these allegations and revelations slowly became public over the last few weeks, and both sides in our current political divide took stock of the situation, there seemed to be a large desire on both the left and the right to sort of fit this into a pre-existing culture war narrative, to come up with an explanation of why this happened that would bolster either the right or the left-wing perspective on the cultural and political system of the West in the contemporary world. And what's so unusual about this whole situation is that the perspectives were almost mirror images of each other. Both the social progressives and the social conservatives, they had a very similar view of the entire situation. When you usually think of culture war controversies that erupt, you usually have a side that's definitively on the offensive and a side that's definitively on the defensive. So, when there's a mass shooting, the right wing will be on the defensive for gun control, the left wing will be on the offensive trying to get this issue more coverage. When there's a terrorist attack, the right might be going full bore on restrictive immigration policies, and the left will be trying to play defense against any policy proposal pushed forward in the wake of this tragedy that's being fueled by the emotions of something like a terrorist incident. And in these situations, regardless of the fact that everyone agrees on the victims, usually the left and the right take up opposite sides of some political issue or some revelation that needs to be confronted inside a given tragedy or inside a given circumstance that's brought forward by political events. They're oppositional. They play different roles. But this dynamic is entirely absent in this current crop of allegations concerning sexual harassment in Hollywood. In this case, both the left and the right are totally on the offensive. And moreover, the narratives about what happened and who's the victim and what needs to be done is more or less the same. It's almost total mirror image, one for the other. Both sides agree it's power, both sides agree it's corruption, both sides agree that there's a cultural force that's causing a malfeasance. Both the left and the right side with the victims, and agree that more needs to be done to tap down on these Hollywood sexual predators who were obviously abusing their power. It's the same position. They're both going on the offensive. No one's playing defense. No one's trying to sweep this under the rug, at least as far as the political activists are concerned. I'm sure there's a fair number of producers and lawyers who would love to sweep this under the ground. But nevertheless, from the activist angle, everyone agrees that this is a poisonous culture, that needs to be confronted, that needs to be reformed, and that something is deeply and endemically wrong with how Hollywood has structured its own sexual dynamics. And it's really funny, because I myself am a social conservative, but I make the practice of listening to people like Christy Winters and ContraPoints, and, I peek in on their Twitter feed, and every now and again I listen to a few minutes of one of their videos. And it's amazing. I mean, they sound like social conservatives. You hear ContraPoints and Christy Winters talking about how we need to punish the evil of these powerful men and how this is just an endemic corrupt sexual culture. I mean, you could just superimpose this onto a religious explanation about how this post-Hugh Hefner sexual revolution attitude towards sex has caused all of these problems throughout the industry and that spilled over into Hollywood and are now manifesting themselves in these sexual harassment allegations. It's really rare that you get a culture war issue where both sides are just sort of repeating back talking points that sound identical. I mean, the only thing that really differs between the two of them is how they explain the root causes of the situation and how they think the culture should change going forward. As they describe the situation and also the mechanisms to reform the situation, they're almost identical. Now, this sort of mirroring might not surprise some people who probably see feminism and social conservatism as two sides of the same coin. But, it made it difficult for me, at least, to react to the situation and kind of put a good explanation of it, or an explanation of it that satisfied myself. And I should add here that, when you really get down to the root causes that feminists and social conservatives and Christians talk about when they try to point out the reasoning behind why this has happened, that has an enormous amount of difference between the two sides. And in a lot of ways, that's sort of the most important question, right? I mean, we both might be outraged about it in the same way. We both might be calling for a reformation that uses the same mechanisms. But ultimately, what people really are looking for when they want analysis of the sexual harassment crisis that Hollywood is undergoing, they're looking for root causes. They're looking for some way that this will all make sense at the end of the day, that they can fit this into a story about human nature, about progress, and kind of go on with their lives and see a future that's better. And of course, on that front, the two sides have huge differences. The social conservative, the Christian, will see the sexual harassment, the sexual abuse, the misconduct as an extension of the sexual revolution. This is the continuation of Hugh Hefner, the continuation of the Playboy philosophy that anything goes. Essentially, it's also an extension of the objectification of women through pornography and the commodification of sex outside of marriage and outside of relationships that really compel both parties to view each other as human beings that need to be valued in their own right, that need to be treated as an end in themselves. And of course, you go to the other side, the feminists see this as an extension of patriarchy, as a reassertion of dominance of the masculine over the feminine, as a repeat of the exploitation women ordinarily see historically and have ordinarily experienced under patriarchy. Again, very different explanations of the root cause. And I've thought about this for a while, and ironically enough, none of it made sense until I sort of, incorporated my understanding of this sexual harassment crisis into what I already knew about the very famous raft of accusations of sexual abuse against priests in my own Catholic church. And once I noticed some of the similarities, it all started falling into place. Now, I think a lot of people misunderstand the priest sex abuse crisis as it existed in the Catholic Church. And I think this misunderstanding has, in many ways, caused or facilitated their misunderstanding of the current Hollywood sexual harassment crisis. And that is, I think, when people looked at the priesthood sexual abuse scandal in the Catholic Church, almost everyone who isn't a Catholic or who doesn't really understand the details or the statistics behind the crisis, they usually assume that the problem of priest sexual abuse stemmed from some implicit or endemic culture of the Catholic Church. Usually it's associated with priesthood celibacy. But those who are more familiar with the priest sex abuse scandal know that it's much more complicated than that. Really, when you look back on past records, when you look back on these crimes, we really see that priest sex abuse had its heyday in the 70s, early 80s, and really was incredibly low either before or after this one particular time. The sex abuse of minors or teenagers by priests was really less of a continuous phenomenon and more a giant spike that occurred roughly after the late 60s and, before the mid 80s. And, you could ask yourself why this was, but I think most people who look at this kind of understand that the reason why there was this explosion of abuses in this time frame was this time frame after the late 60s and before the 80s or 90s was really a time when the moral system in the Catholic Church seemed particularly weak. You had Vatican II and all these new teachings coming in, and it seemed for a moment as if anything might go. The Catholic Church was neither a traditionalist institution, because it seemed like traditions were being uprooted everywhere, but it was not a progressive one either. So it seemed like a place that was in constant flux. Seminaries developed very lax standards. They did not enforce strict moral discipline during this time. And many clergy and parishioners got the idea that a lot of the teachings the Catholic Church still held to officially might not actually be really serious or really important to uphold. And in this confusion arose the huge spike that was the Catholic sex abuse scandal. And sure enough, as soon as you had sort of the changing of an era and the John Paul II era of the church emerge, where essentially orthodoxy was reasserted in a very real way, a lot of the incidents of sexual abuse died down, even though the revelation of these abuses exploded on John Paul II's watch in a sort of cruelly ironic way. But all right, so where am I going with this? Why did I bring up this whole observation about the Catholic sex abuse scandals when I'm trying to find some explanation for the Hollywood sexual harassment scandals? Well, that is because it occurred to me that we may be asking the wrong question when we ask what culture or moral system allows for this kind of sexual harassment or sexual abuse to occur in the first place. I mean, I don't mean to be a moral relativist. I certainly believe that some moral cultures are superior to others, but for the most part, there's no moral system widely popular, even among the highly misguided moral systems of the left, that says that Harvey Weinstein's or Louis C.K.'s actions were good. These people knew what they were doing was wrong. They would have been condemned by their peers to the extent that their actions were made public. There are many blind spots in modernity's moral structures and their ability to perceive evil. But just outright harassment and abuse and perhaps even rape of women isn't one of them. For the most part, even in the contemporary world, we know this is wrong. Christians, atheists, feminists, communists, Nazis, we all know this is wrong. So the problem is very unlikely to come from the difficulties with one moral system. A much more parsimonious explanation for this, in my mind, is that this chaos, this perception that anything could be done and anything could be really gotten away with, comes from a sort of confusion or transition between moral systems. Hollywood in the era of the Hays Code had very clear definitions of what was expected of producers and stars that represented movie studios. Now, that wasn't to say there weren't abuses, there wasn't a casting couch, there weren't horrible scandals. I've heard many of them from classic Hollywood. But still, there was a certain expectation that the members of Hollywood conduct themselves under the moral system that was followed by most of America, the pre-sexual revolution moral system. Post-60s, post-70s, and now heading into the 2000s and 2010s, we're really moving away from a Christian moral system and towards a progressive or feminist one. And this creates, real chaos in terms of the expectations, in terms of what people think they might be able to get away with, what people think might be acceptable. And I think it's this confusion more than anything else that attracts people who have an inclination to abuse and harass people that they have under their power. It's the confusion and the chaos that attracts the abusers. Because the chaos, confusion, and lack of a clear expectation can be exploited by parties that are committed to doing something untoward, exploitative, or downright evil in order to justify their actions or make it seem like their actions might be acceptable in some context. No one knows what the rules are, it's really unclear, and if the person has enough power, they might be able to get away with it. I mean, you could see this all throughout the harassment stories that surround people like Harvey Weinstein and Louis C.K. I mean, these guys were feminists, but they kind of existed in this limbo. Feminism was a way to sort of get out of the restrictions of the older Christian morality, but it was never a reason not to put women in compromising positions, not to use their power to exploit women. This was a highly selective feminism. A feminism where you could pressure a woman into initiating a sexual encounter with you, and then sort of write that off as her own empowerment. I mean, it's ridiculous when you think about it, but it's the kind of explanations that become all the more tenable when two contradictory moral systems collide. I mean, those actions would have been unacceptable in either the Christian moral system or the feminist moral system, but if you take a few principles from one and mix them with the contradictory principles of the other, you can come up with any set of ideas that will justify your actions retroactively. And this is perfect for abusers, because the confusion about what's moral, what's immoral, what's ethical, what's unethical, what's seemly or unseemly just becomes a huge space for them to operate their own abusive desires out of. And of course, this leads to a totally untenable and unacceptable situation from which to operate a culture. The older and older I get, the more I just sort of get this sneaking suspicion that this libertine and cultural libertarian attitude where, consent's the only standard of the good, and it's this very transactional view of human interaction, the more I see this as really a totally artificial feature of a totally morally confused culture. The only reason why these sort of libertine attitudes towards sex and towards human interaction are even tenable is because, we're in the process of a huge cultural shift. And because neither the old moral system nor the new one can be accepted in its entirety, people can just, ignore all of the normative prescriptions of either system, and you get this very libertarian attitude towards the whole endeavor. And, we've seen in the last month why this isn't going to work, why this creates situations that are just impossible to deal with in a reasonable way or accept. I mean, even admitting the stuff that's this strictly illegal, the harassment and the frankly incredibly creepy and disgusting behavior you see out of these incredibly powerful men, it's just not going to be acceptable to audiences, to people who want to work in these industries, to people who want to use these industries as brands for entertainment products worldwide. And that's sort of what leaves social conservatives and social progressives saying almost the same thing, saying, this is immoral, this is unacceptable, this is just rank power and libertine behavior self-justifying itself. I mean, me and someone like ContraPoints sees Louis C.K. and they want them punished. They should be punished. They want some moral system to constrain their behavior. No, I want a traditionalist, perhaps Christian moral system. ContraPoints wants a feminist one. But we both see the fact that this vacancy of any moral system just can't continue. It's not sustainable. I think this sort of leads us to a very particular observation about what we can expect to come out of this latest rash of sexual harassment and sexual abuse allegations in Hollywood. I think we can just expect this to accelerate the culture war, to accelerate and vindicate the cause of cultural progressivism and feminism inside these institutions. I mean, given the nature of the crimes involved and really the cultural state of the feminist community, you're just not going to have people allow for any more leeway for people to get away with minor assurances that, no, really, guys, I'm a feminist. I believe in equality. Therefore, herder, I'm one of the good men. Progressives are going to be looking to set the bar much, much higher to assure that people, and men in particular, are meeting the higher aspirations and higher standards standards of feminism, that they don't objectify women, that they understand why the male gaze is harmful. I mean, these sound ridiculous to people who aren't part of the feminist movement or cultural progressive movement, but I mean, they're entirely reasonable to a believer. I mean, the current situation is untenable, and if I believed as they did, I certainly would be demanding this of people who I thought were trying to stand for a progressive worldview, or at least were presenting themselves as purveyors of a progressive worldview. And so despite the fact that it looks like from the outside that this sexual harassment scandal is just one powerful feminist man after the other being exposed as a hypocrite, being exposed as a liar, being exposed as a person who holds a double standard for himself and others, despite the fact from the outside that this just looks like feminist hypocrisy that it must at some point be realized, this will result in a doubling down on progressive and feminist principles. And I imagine that progressive thought leaders already are putting a plan in place to make sure that deviations from the feminist moral line are no longer acceptable. And this is going to accelerate the culture war. This could bring people like Anis Sarkeesian and Jonathan McIntosh into very, very, very high places of power inside of our entertainment industry. I mean, people like Sarkeesian and McIntosh have answers. They can give an explanation for why this happened and why, perhaps with an application of their moral virtues, it might not happen again in the future. I mean, that's plausible. What's not plausible is continuing on with this status quo. And I can't blame them, because if I were called in to try to fix the problem of Hollywood sexual harassment, I probably would recommend bringing in more of my own traditionalist morals to confront the very same problem. And it might not look so different from the feminist solution, ultimately. But that being said, it's not going to be all that simple for them, because, as much as in this talk I'm sort of presenting feminism and progressivism and Christianity and traditionalism as sort of mirror images of each other, they aren't mirror images of each other in an ultimate sense. And that is because I think that feminism is based on a false conception of humanity. It's based on a naive conception of humanity and a utopian one. And as such, as they accelerate, as they double down, try to reintroduce more purified notions of their own morality in order to fix this problem, I think they're either going to exacerbate the issues already involved in Hollywood culture, or they're just going to drive the industry that they've commandeered into the ground. I mean, so much of the feminist and progressive dominance in these cultural spheres, especially Hollywood, has been the fact that they've been tightly allied to these powerful white men, many of which who we now know were hugely morally deviant in their sexual attitudes and sexual behaviors. And much of the power and clout that feminism was able to gain was essentially bestowed upon them by these white male rainmakers, partially as a way of virtue signaling, but in many cases as a sort of mea culpa or act of contrition for their own shitty behavior. If the purists get their way, as they probably will, and this deal just disappears, where it becomes incredibly hard for some straight white male filmmaker to virtue signal in a progressive way without totally abasing himself, or where it becomes totally impossible to make a sexual harassment problem of a supposedly feminist filmmaker simply go away because they're on our side, it might be very, very difficult for feminist and progressive forces to get the same kind of clout inside the entertainment industry that they once had. The fact remains, at the end of the day, feminism has 1,000 critiques and criticisms of male behavior, but it has no positive vision of masculinity or a male life that it actually likes. So, as blind eyes start becoming harder and harder to come across, people who fall into the dreaded straight white male category and work in the film industry might find that they have less and less and less ground to stand on. Furthermore, if the purists on the progressive side get their way and are able to recreate Hollywood in their own image, I'm not so sure that they can really tell the kind of stories that non-feminists and non-progressives want to hear. If their solution to masculinity and the problems of masculinity is to essentially destroy masculinity in any way that we would recognize it, I'm not so sure you're going to be able to tell a compelling story or make more blockbusters that people around the world are really going to want to buy and consume. I mean, feminism was a Brahmin religion held by a very, very small number of people who had influence in very, very high places. Their clout and political power and leverage came from the fact that they could successfully control the morality of the decision makers and rainmakers while simultaneously operating and speaking for a culture that was more or less not on board with what they were teaching or talking about. If that minor hypocrisy becomes untenable as a consequence of the Hollywood sexual harassment scandals, this status as an elite religion that calls the shots and is never questioned might become a lot harder for them. In other words, entertainment is fine if there's a few feminist themes stuck in here and there, but if the pure moralists take over, no one's going to want to watch a wall-to-wall feminist film with all of the critiques of Anita Sarkeesian and Jonathan McIntosh fully manifested in the plot and the character development. And this creates, in my mind, a huge opportunity, because I think Hollywood is going to go down this route. I think that the progressives are going to start asserting their control over the actual creative content in a lot of Hollywood creations, and that a lot of the exceptions they made are now going to start drying up. And for those interested in alternative media, like myself, and probably a lot of people who listen to this channel, that's an opportunity. The god of Hollywood is bleeding, and it might never reach the same stature it once had in American culture. And that's a vacuum that a lot of things could fill. A lot of really interesting creative forces could come in and take its place. I'm talking about alternative media. I'm talking about traditionalist art forms. I'm talking about the dissident right and other groups who felt like they've been eternally locked out of the entertainment industry and cultural production industry, suddenly finding themselves as stakeholders in a much, much larger game. It's a long shot, but the possibilities are just astonishing when you think about them. At any rate, I hope you enjoyed this quick take. I will probably speak a little bit more about this subject when I get the time. But in the meanwhile, I hope you're having a good fall and have a wonderful evening.